Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats or you'll start immediately. So, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen.
So, colleagues, I would like to reopen the meeting. And we will start with item 10 on the agenda, the exchange of views with our ambassador to the WTO, Mr. Pangratis. Welcome. The World Trade Organization, colleagues, is very often the focus of public discussion, particularly after the progress that was expected in Bali. It was hoped that we would be able to take further steps forward in the WTO. But those expectations were not fulfilled, and we have seen so far that the trade facility agreement has so far failed, and it would appear that the stumbling blocks were greater than originally thought. So that's the situation. Next week, the WTO will be having its Parliamentary Assembly. And in February, the Ministerial Council will be held, a conference will be held. So I think this is a good time point to have a discussion about the situation in the WTO and how we should deal with that in the future. And Ambassador, when we discuss this subject, the question always crops up of how should the WTO operate in the future? Would it not be better to perhaps focus more on regional or other multinational systems? In addition to specific negotiations, there are other matters on which we have to work with the WTO. So clearly there is a reason to support the WTO and to canvass for general support for it. And I think that is not just the WTO's job, it is our task as well that we should strengthen the multilateral approach. So we have a whole range of questions that can be covered in this discussion. I'm very happy to have you here, Mr. Pangratis, and I give you the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very glad to have this opportunity to talk to you about the WTO. I will talk briefly about the importance of WTO and multilateral negotiations, and I will, of course, concentrate and specifically talk about the state of play on the trade facilitation agreement, the Bali and post-Bali, and the prospects for the DDA, as I was requested to do. But I will also talk about, in a little bit wider terms, about the current crisis in the organization that might well become not just one of many, but probably the one that will bring profound changes in the negotiating processes and methods of the organization. As I will concentrate most of my time on problems and challenges and difficulties of the negotiating function, let me start by saying that it is important that we keep in mind the context of this discussion. The WTO is much more than just the negotiating function. It has other important functions, as the Chair mentioned. The dispute settlement does not need presentation. I just remind you that is something that is unique Nothing comparable exists in bilateral or plurilateral trade agreements, despite the efforts to build some of it elsewhere. And nothing comparable exists in the wider multilateral world, the agreements and the organizations. Then is the monitoring and surveillance functions that are extremely important. They were greatly enhanced as a result of the crisis, and they are credited with a very important role in preventing the crisis to cause a surge in protectionism. And then there is a big space, often underestimated, we call regular work, which is the implementation, administration, operation of the existing agreements. And worth noting that what is happening there, it has also a very important dimension of preventing frictions, conflicts, and preventing disputes. Of course, these other functions are operationally and on the short term operating in parallel and independently from the negotiating function. However, for the long term, a weakening of the negotiating function of the organization means a weakening of the whole organization. Overall, the WTO is recognized as a very, I would say, very precious organization in the global architecture, and is illustrated also by the fact that it has 160 members, 23 countries have already applied and are in accession process. Also, not to forget that from the negotiating point of view, the negotiating function of the WTO has strong unique characteristics and advantages. I will mention the two main ones, which is first that a lot of the core issues of international trade negotiations, including subsidies in agriculture, disputes, domestic support in agriculture, or export subsidies and others, can only be negotiated in a multilateral forum. And also the fact, and that's the second advantage recognized, is the fact that the bilateral agreements, of course, cause the risk that we all know very well, what we call the spaghetti ball or the regulatory fragmentation. That means things going in very different directions that can cause an increased amount of problems for the companies, and make clear that even if we deviate from the multilateral basis of the negotiations and we go to bilaterals or others, sometime down the road we will have to return to the multilateral basis. It is also the place and the setup, the forum, where the smaller, the weaker, the vulnerable have a real place and a real voice. So, of course, with all these advantages of the WTO, it's important to keep in mind too the obvious, that we are facing what can be called a multilateral paradox, which basically is that in a world where interdependence increases, where complexity increases, and where objectively we need more and more common rules and common solutions. In fact, during these last years, we have been less and less able to deliver. Overall, the multilateral negotiations and approaches remain our priority, in the sense that we are always very committed, very alert. Anything that has a realistic chance to advance multilaterally or to be delivered multilaterally, the EU, you will see the EU, everybody sees the EU in Geneva, proactive, substantive, with a strong initiative, with a strong leadership when needed, and of course we will continue to have the same approach. Allow me to add just a word on the purely EU dimension, because of course the WTO is unique, also because the EU has a unique role there. It's probably, not probably, it's certainly in our overall external relations the place where the EU has constantly one message delivered by one voice. The EU plays an absolutely central role in the WTO, which member states recognize as being clearly in their national interest, we increase our efficiency, our influence, and we serve best the interests of our citizens. It's also important to note that across board, the EU in the WTO is widely recognized as a positive force, often being on middle ground, often speaking and seeking compromises and solutions. On a personal note, if you allow me, Chair, with more than 30 years of service in the external relations of the EU, including in trade policy, I would say the WTO is a very rewarding experience from that point of view, seeing the EU being as united, as efficient, as influential as it can be. Now, let me come to the state of play of the negotiations. That's what you want to hear about mostly. The facts are clear. The WTO was created in 1995. The DDA was launched in 2001. And the only multilateral delivery that appeared as a result was Bali in 2013. And this result is put in doubt 7 months after it was reached, because basically one member refused to implement a key component of what was agreed in Bali. Most say that, in fact, through this situation, the WTO is simply confirming its inability to deliver. And it returns to this frozen status where it was for many years, where negotiating efforts were wasted and, or were transformed into texts that were unusable or, in fact, in any case, not really used. I will give you a little bit of a different message. Yes, this risk exists. The organization can return to a frozen state and we can lose the work done. But this time is different in many respects. The WTO is not condemned to inaction and inability to deliver. The Bali illustrated that the WTO can negotiate and can deliver again. What we are dealing with, I would argue, is a complex organization that evolves and tries to adapt to a profoundly changing world and tries to recover its ability to deliver. We have to manage a complex transition and transformation which started mainly at MC8 in 2011 and will reach a very interesting moment, probably a decisive one, in the coming weeks. So it's the right moment to talk about it. Let me briefly explain this. MC8 2011, it was the beginning of the process I'm referring to. At that time, in December 2011, we came to the conclusion that we were unable to deliver DDA. We faced reality. We decided not to continue, pretend to negotiate without a chance to get an outcome. But to try to change things. The WTO has been for a long time in a straitjacket where it has a mandate that it cannot deliver, that it could not deliver at all until that moment. And at the same time, this jacket was so straight that we could not even talk about other issues that are not part of the mandate that are of interest to the members. This is a machine of building irrelevance or loss of credibility. And in fact, what we did at MC8 is to inject flexibility in a simple way, to say that we will work in a more flexible way. We will make progress where progress is possible. We will explore new innovative ways to negotiate. Let me say immediately that this was not a change of the texts, of the letter of the spirit of the texts that we had, but it was an understanding that was put in the conclusion of MC8 that guided the organization from there on. It sounds very simple, but agreeing with more than 155 members that we somehow changed the basis on which we are negotiating is not a simple thing. And it happened because at that time already we had the sense of a very deep crisis that required changes. It was clear at that moment that we were entering into a last-ditch effort to transform, to evolve, to unfreeze. The reasons of failure in 2011, I will not enter into the details. It's a big discussion. Of course, fundamentally, there was one fundamental reason, and this was basically the fact that the world has changed since the mandate was defined, particularly concerning the balance between developed countries and the big developing, the emerging, in terms of market access. Now, this was a moment where the then DG said the gap is too big, cannot be bridged. This should not be underestimated. It's a very pertinent part of the reality we have to face, and we will have to face again if we go down the road of trying to conclude DDA. But I would not like to leave the impression or to follow the line that is widely repeated around us, that because the world has changed so much, because it has become so complicated, the WTO cannot deliver anymore. And Bali proved exactly that there is a way to move forward, even in a more complex world, even in facing reality, in facing difficulties, but we have to face difficulties, but at the same time to be realistic about what can be done. So we used this flexibility of MC8. Between MC8 and MC9, the Bali, I will be brief. There is a lot to say, but I will be brief. Basically, what we did, we developed a new way to build an agenda of negotiation, a new platform of negotiating bottom-up. We avoided the real red lines. We do not insist on each other to do things that we know others cannot deliver. We built on issues that are of interest to all. Trade facilitation is an issue of wide interest to all categories of countries. Then we build a flexible balance. That's the 10 decisions of the Bali package around the trade facilitation. So we built an agenda, we built a new balance, and we negotiated in a similar way, building convergence. My point is that Bali was not a coincidence. I think it's very important to understand that. It was the result of a long path of more than 2 years that transformed in many respects the way that we are working in the WTO. And the flexibility that was injected in the system, in the texts and in the spirits at MC8 resulted to the Bali outcome, but also the progress that we have seen on the plurilaterals, ITA expansion, TISA, environmental goods. There are also things that initiatives that emerged in Geneva. And Bali did something more than just illustrate by an outcome the evolution that I'm talking about, of the way of doing things. It also convinced everybody in Geneva that it is possible to deliver multilaterally. It created a very strong will not to lose this work, this great effort, not have the experience that we had in the past, where negotiating efforts were wasted. And and all this together, it's certainly a big part of a certain transformation that was very much needed. But of course, this transformation was not complete. There are other aspects. One that became very obvious now with the new crisis that was also very obvious in the last day of the Bali negotiations, particularly in the last long night until the morning where we finally concluded. And this is what I call sometimes the negative power of one. You need unanimity. If you have a magnificent process where you build an agenda that makes sense for everybody, you negotiate an outcome that is acceptable basically to everybody, it still takes one member decided to go in a different direction at any moment, even after the agreement, to block the whole thing. And it's disturbing for the future to think that the leverage of this negative one, and I don't say the negative is always the same, but the leverage of this negative one will increase if we go down the road and we continue to negotiate even more important things. There is no answer to that. Now, the situation we are now it's very difficult and very serious, as Jean-Luc Demarty said already this morning. Basically, with the refusal of a member not to implement an important component of the Bali package, which was the commitment to sign off the protocol on trade facilitation by the 31st of July. The commitment was very clear. It's not a commitment to negotiate or to reach some complicated outcome at some stage. It was a commitment to implement subject to legal scrubbing. So the fact that this was not there was no delivery on this commitment, this was not upheld by a member, at least, means that the system has no credibility to renegotiate. We cannot renegotiate the same thing. It's very difficult to go back when you have such a complex deal, a result of so complex process, such a long process of balancing interests as reflected in 10 decisions, and then take a piece out of it and try to renegotiate the balance. It looks completely impossible. It's not a matter for one member, us not wanting. It's an impossible task for the organization, because if we accept something like this, then there will be other members who will come back on other aspects of the deal. So we cannot renegotiate Bali, and that's very clear. We cannot renegotiate the post-Bali because, for the same reasons, we don't have the agreed basis on which to renegotiate, on which to negotiate the post-Bali, and the way forward is very demanding, very difficult. However, it's important to realize that the difficulty that we are in is not due to the substance of the requests we are facing. You know that the difficulty is the link between the trade facilitation. The difficulty is the link made, particularly by one member, between the trade facilitation and the public stockpiling system that it has, that India has, which is seen as a food security issue and is very important domestically. Now, food security is a very important issue for the whole membership, for us and for others too. Nobody disputes that. And also the requests as they were put to the membership in that context, which were to see the peace clause. We have a peace clause for the practices of India and other developing countries concerning public stockpiling, to interpret it so that it lasts for the whole period until there is a permanent solution. The will to accelerate the deadline for the permanent solution. We have agreed in Bali that we will find a permanent solution by 2017. Now, India asks to accelerate that. This is a substantive request. And also the will to accelerate the outcome on possible development issues. These are requests that in substance we are very willing to commit and try to accommodate. These are not requests that we or fundamentally nobody in the membership frontally rejects those requests. The real difficulty to move forward is the link established with trade facilitation and the blocking of the protocol of trade facilitation, because it does not respect Bali, it does not respect the agreed basis to move forward. So from a certain point of view, this is a tactical link or a political link. It's not the substance concerned by the two issues, but it's the link, this tactical link, this political link that puts the organization in an impossible situation to move forward, and it's very dangerous. It's a very dangerous moment because of this link fundamentally. It's a very simple thing in substance on the basis of the whole arguments. You can argue a lot about many aspects, but the substantive link that really puts in danger the system is this one. And this is very simple. It reminds me of the challenge that we have with the Mediterranean with the forests around the Mediterranean. You know, when a forest is burned, it can regenerate. Even if you burn and you don't intervene, it regenerates. And it can regenerate hundreds of times. But there is a critical moment. If there is a fire and then the forest is gone, and then the new trees come, and from the moment they start having a certain height, they are burnt again. Then the old grain is gone, and the new grain is not produced. And then the forest cannot regenerate anymore. It reminds me of this parallelism because the WTO has regenerated in many stages during the process of negotiations, but this is a dangerous one because it's this combination of non-respect of the commitment in a crucial moment where the organization had started recovering credibility, and we cannot go back. We can only move forward. So in this situation, and I come to the end of my conclusion, Chair, the next steps and the conclusion in 6 points, briefly. What happens from now on? First, the multilateral path from which we were distracted on the 31st of July because of the situation that I hope I have explained clearly. It can be recovered. We should leave the necessary space of time and substance to India and other countries that share some of the aspects of this discussion to try to recover the process, of course, being understood that it can be recovered within the framework of the Bali decisions. So flexibility, yes, but respecting the Bali decision. This is the huge priority that we have. This is the best scenario under the situation. Don't ask me to speculate about the probability of success. I would say that it's bigger than 0%. But you follow the domestic political situation in India. There is a probability there, and it should not be underestimated, and we should exhaust all the margins that there are to recover the multilateral process properly. Second point, it has to be clear that if the current impasse continues a few more weeks, I would say, because unfortunately time works against us, the resulting crisis will most certainly be the deepest of the WTO as we know it. Third point, if this happens, it has also to be clear, I think, in our minds and as we think about the future, that the worst scenario for the interests of the EU and, in fact, for the interests of the vast majority of members is that would be that the crisis will bring back WTO to its frozen status with the Bali package, including trade facilitation agreement, lost. This is clearly in nobody's interest. The fourth point is, as I said before, I tried to explain the process. It's very important to analyze and understand the positions of the members. Bali gave the feeling to the membership, to the wider membership in Geneva, that it is possible to deliver. And it gave the strong desire not to lose what we have done in Bali, including trade facilitation agreement. The big majority of the developing countries want the trade facilitation agreement and what goes with it, which means that the members will start thinking. You can read already articles and statements on plurilateral options. If the deadline is confirmed, this orientation might become irresistible if plurilateral options are the only options left. My fifth point is that in such a scenario, it's not going to be an easy scenario. The WTO will enter into a crisis that can be transformative in many respects. It will enter into a fundamental debate about its future role and its future way of working. And my sixth point will be that in a scenario of the kind and all the above options, The EU line will always be following the principles that we have always followed in the multilateral negotiations and apply now too, to keep solutions within the WTO, to favor the multilateral solutions to the all extent possible, or solutions that are quickest to can result the quickest to multilateralization, and to try in this process with a focus on multilateral options to uphold Bali, to deliver the DDA, and to open the organization to the 21st century. And in all the above, I repeat, Chair, because I think is the main guiding principle that we will unavoidably have, and I trust you will agree, we need to avoid, the bottom line of our interest is to avoid my option 3, the worst scenario that the organization gets in a frozen status again. Chair, I finish my presentation just saying that the EU has played a central role in the current transition during the last years that I described, and we will certainly need to continue to do so, and this is our intention. The input and support of INTA will be crucial at every step. I thank you for your attention and for the opportunity to give me to summarize the situation as I see it to you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much for that. And now, Mr. Ambassador, I think that you have managed to bring some of the spirit of optimism into the room. We've already had a lot of reports over the WTO, and just things as forestry and a whole range of different issues. So all our respect for the detail of that report. So now, Madam McClan.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador, for your views that you shared with us this afternoon of the current status as you see it. I think your motto must be the same as mine, which is nothing is impossible. And we can hope and believe that is the case. But I'm just starting out following the WTO steering group more closely. And so I was wondering, since you're coming to sort of the end of your term, what you think the EU's achievements have been, where you think the focus needs to be for us in the future, and hoping that we can use the motto of nothing is impossible. What are your views on the prospects of some reform around the rule on unanimity in trying to get a change in the decision-making so that we can avoid the stalemate going forward? Are we going to be able to do something about that? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Judith.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that report on the negotiations. I was intrigued that you said if there's no movement, we'll see the development of plurilateral agreements. And obviously, we're already seeing the development of plurilateral negotiations. We now have 3 negotiations ongoing, which are alongside the WTO. So it would be quite interesting to have your view on 2 aspects of those. 18 months into the trade in services negotiations, we're nowhere near reaching the critical mass which would allow that plurilateral agreement to move into multilateral talks. And obviously there's a big debate about the absence of any of the BRICS countries from the negotiations. So what's your view from your perspective at the WTO in terms of China and Uruguay joining? And following on from that, it would be really interesting to have your take on where you see those negotiations going. Obviously, the WTO isn't formally a party to the negotiations, but I imagine that you're working in close collaboration with your colleagues. And do you see any kind of perspective of the likelihood of reaching a critical mass and a movement from those negotiations from plurilateral to multilateral? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Ska.
Thanks a lot. I mean, following up on TISA, it would be also very interesting to hear your view about the compatibility with WTO framework. And a bit linked to what you've been saying about possible future of the WTO and which direction things could be heading. I mean, you have also been hinting at that the EU has always had a strong stance on multilateralism, and sure, that's true if we just look at what we hear in speeches, but then if we look more into practice and what sort of negotiations are being done, then at least to me it seems, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, that the EU certainly has lost interest in multilateralism. And that is obvious in things like all the bilateral agreements and the plurilateral agreements of all sorts, of all kinds. And I mean, you're based in Geneva, you're in the middle of all of it. And what would you say is your personal impression about how much you're being valued in the EU, how much Geneva is the center also of EU trade policy, or whether there has been a shift in the past years? I think this your personal insight in that would be very much valuable. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ambassador. I have to admit that before Bali I was quite reluctant to believe in the multilateral path, but afterwards I agree with you, I am quite optimistic. But my question is, what are the main barriers to get the agreement? A part of the political situation in India you mentioned. Do you perceive any further difficulties in any other members regarding India? If finally, I mean, there is a barrier there, or is a barrier in India, is there a plan B between the possible agreement or implementation of the agreement and the no agreement at all? These are my questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Helmut. Thank you. Thank you, and good to having you back in this committee. Just you have described very in an extensive way the whole political and economic weight of the situation where we are in with the multilateral trading system and the WTO. And you said that we cannot go back, that there's no opportunity for a renegotiating process in any substance. Of course, there is always a chance or the danger that we are falling back, because we have to deal with two lines, I think, in the debate. We have the hard law and the soft law. The hard law are the commercial interests of the United States, the European Union, leading economies in the OECD structure, etc. And we have the soft law trying to catch up with this hard law in the developing countries. And the question is, and I agree with you that we should avoid any falling back, because, you know, I'm a fighter for the multilateral trading system, because we have to understand the reality in these countries. So the reality in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh is different to the reality in the European Union. That means if there is still the 10% of the value of agricultural production under danger, while the TFA would be realized, that means then the food would be more expensive, even under this reached compromise, for the Indian consumers. So how India as a government has to deal with the challenge. And we know the Bali situation has been just before the elections in India, so trying to avoid a political clash in this country. The outcome of the election had been different. So just now, this new government is dealing with the situation as a former government. And we have to answer from the European Union how to deal with it. So maybe a seventh point to your 6 points is adding how we can democratize the decision-making process in the WTO, reflecting this internal debate in the society. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Liebe Kollegen, wir haben jetzt...
So, dear colleagues, we've got 6 people want to speak, and then I will probably close after that. So, Mr. Dartmouth, Lord Dartmouth, please.
Okay. There's a lot I could say, but I'm going to just content myself with a technical question, or a couple of technical questions. Trade agreements have, of course, been an exclusive EU competence from well before the Lisbon Treaty. Indeed, my country has been bound by EU agreements since 1975. And MS Keller used the phrase EU trade policy, which there clearly is. Notwithstanding, individual member states have seats at the World Trade Organization. Now, in the case of the British government, which is one I'm familiar with, they send people to sit in the seat, but the seat is inactive. To use the same word again a different way for the translator, it's in abeyance. So you're, as the EU ambassador to the World Trade Organization, how does the interface actually work between you and member states with seats at the WTO who send delegations there? I mean, do your views always prevail? Do you say this is what it is and here it is and this is what I want you to be aware of? Or do they come to you and say we're very worried about powdered eggs or something similar, and please can you do that? I mean, how does it actually work? And since we have the privilege of being in your physical presence, I would very much appreciate if you could just comment.
Frau Mosca.
Sì, grazie.
Yes, thank you.
Sui tempi, sia questa mattina nello scambio.
Yes, this morning there was an exchange of views, and you stressed that we were talking about the very tight timescales, 2 or 3 weeks. And I'd like to know what actually is the time scheduling in order to find ourselves with an answer to the questions that you've brought up for us here, so the time scale. And the second question is, this morning, once again, you underlined the importance of the developing countries. I'm very interested to understand better what the role is that they might play and how they might play this role. So what actually can the developing countries do in order to lead towards a positive closure of the agreement? Third question, you underlined that here we're not talking about substantive obstacles in order to close off the agreement in terms of the demands that are coming forward from India. Well, if these aren't substantive obstacles, what can we do to try and find now, given that they've tried to do almost every road possible, to get to the aim that we all hope we're going to get to? So given the political timetables that are coming up and the various attempts that have been made, what can we do in order to move things forward also with China?
Thank you very much, Chair, Ambassador. Welcome. I have 3 questions, but I'll be brief. With regard to TISA, the services agreement, which includes many players, but China has been blocked by the United States. Is there any EU efforts to seek to unblock this stalemate? And do you see any opportunity or wish to incorporate TISA in any WTO initiatives, or can it spark a WTO process along the same lines? And last question is that the WTO dispute settlement mechanism has been suggested as a way to challenge China's blocking and censoring of internet and other media and audiovisual services. Previously, China banned access to the market of US audiovisual materials. Do you think that there is an opportunity to pick up this point in the context of dispute settlement? Thank you.
Frau Sanchez.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions for the Ambassador, if I may. Let me begin by commenting on Article 208 of the Lisbon Treaty. It says that the Union will pursue the objectives of development when dealing with policies that may affect developing countries. Now, we all know that in every trade relation, we must pursue these development goals, i.e. reduction of poverty in the short term, eradication of poverty in the long term. However, we see day in, day out that this is not good enough for Europe, because in our trade policy we do everything but eradicating injustice. There is tremendous contradiction between the commercial policy of the EU and the furtherance of development in the developing countries. So how do you coordinate with the other people involved in WTO to further development? Do you meet with the DG and Co frequently, for instance? And my second question to you would be, in connection with the binding treaty that has been promoted by the Council for Human Rights of the United Nations, which serves inter alia to do away with impunity in violation of human rights perpetrated by multinationals. And I should like to know what your opinion is on this future treaty. Is the European Union supporting this? What do you think of impunity in general of the multinationals? Thank you.
Frau Rodriguez.
Thank you very much indeed, Chairman. And I should like to thank the Ambassador also for his presentation. Mr. Ambassador, you said that the worst scenario for the multilateral community would be for the WTO to go back into a frozen status. I would agree with you. Even though this is almost, we're very close to that. But you also said that we could recover the multilateral approach if we give ourselves a reasonable period of time. Now, sir, what do you think is the reasonable period of time so as to be able to recover the multilateral approach? Also, I would really like to know, and I'm echoing what somebody else said, would you have a plan B to avoid the freezing of the WTO? Considering that there's a tremendous amount of pressure on the part of the countries that have gone into a formal agreement, is there a risk that this may drift into a sort of bilateral splintering of the multilateral agreement? Last point. China is pressuring to get into an agreement with India. What do you think of the possibilities of a virtual China-India agreement vis-à-vis the multilateral community?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Ambassador, I would like your reaction on the critique that the WTO law, not just the agreements, but especially their interpretation by the appellate body, are becoming a kind of transnational economic constitution that prevails over national constitutional economic norms, especially in the fields of privatizations or deregulation. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, now the floor and the possibility to answer to all questions in 8 minutes. So, excuse me, perhaps I forgot, but please try to make your position very clear and use your card so that everybody is aware about it. But please.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ambassador, negotiators are now working on TTIP. And if approved, this will be the greatest single bilateral agreement ever signed. Even now, without any FTA, the EU and US accounts for roughly $1 trillion a year in trade flow. So in the words of its proponents, the TTIP will dwarf any previous trade agreement. So if such an agreement is signed, what will be, in your opinion, its impact on the multilateral trade system? I mean, is the WTO Doha round already dead and the TTIP is simply putting a nail in the coffin? Or its announced negotiations have played an active role in shutting the round down? Do you believe that TTIP, together with the TPP, is the signal that bilateral trade deals will be the norm? Or, on the contrary, do you believe that such large and important bilateral agreements will push countries to cooperate, to avoid being locked out of the trade flows, and therefore invigorate the WTO?
So, just 6 minutes.
Well, I must say, Chair, I'm very sorry because this is an impressive list of very important issues that are really inviting, I think, a very interesting discussion. So let me try to be very brief, and I'm sorry about that, but I have to follow the guidance of the chair. The starting point, the chair started saying that I brought some optimism. The first question was about optimism. You know, I face this comment often in different forms, and my answer to that is always, it's not optimism, it's simply that the EU will never give up to the multilateral options. We are committed to explore all the margins. That's the real explanation of the message and the commitment to look for solutions under any circumstances. My term is not finished yet. It goes until September next year, so I hope I will have a chance to do the bilan at a future occasion. I think the EU, in terms of achievements, basically will say only the EU has established itself as a very positive force, extremely respected, seen as an entity to listen carefully to and to follow to a very great extent, because we work for the benefit of the institution, because we believe in the institution, and we have naturally positions that are positions of compromise. There are reasons for that, but I hope we will have a chance to talk about it. Change the rule of unanimity is not the idea. Unanimity, nobody wants to enter into this discussion about unanimity directly. But everybody realizes that the plurilateral concept is very fluid. It's everywhere. A lot of the agreements that the organization is doing are plurilateral. They are not put in doubt the unanimity, and the real pressure for the future is to bring in that direction more things, in the plurilateral direction more things, and eventually the TF agreement. This is the debate that might come on us. The movement in plurilateral is happening already, yes. I mentioned this in my comments. TISA, ITA, the environmental goods, plurilaterals that are advancing. There are a lot of questions about TISA. I would say that we have seen significant progress in the work of TISA. The big question is the entrance of new participants that will increase and will increase the size. The big question is China. I think Jean-Luc this morning also said that we have taken openly a position in favor of the entrance of China, but China needs to also respond to the anxieties of others and on the condition of its participation in the different plurilateral efforts, and we are in a critical moment of the negotiation on our ITA expansion currently. But overall, the work have advanced well or have engaged in environmental goods positively. I would certainly be very reassuring on the issue of the EU has lost interest to multilateralism. I tried to say this in my presentation. Multilateralism remains a very strong priority by all standards for us. But of course, we have to be realistic. We face a situation where multilaterally we were collectively not able to deliver for a long time now. What means to be committed is, as I said, is that every time that something can happen multilaterally, we are there to help it happen. We have the resources and the ability to take the initiatives needed to push multilateral progress where it can realistically happen. The main difficulties, Pablo, I think, asked a very pertinent question, because and my answer will be very brief. Now we have India and this link between the public stockpiling and the trade facilitation. This is the immediate thing that can have devastating consequences. But of course, if we get over this difficulty and we enter into the multilateral process, we will face a major challenge to try to conclude DDA immediately. The post-Bali work is about concluding DDA, and this is going to be in substance a major challenge. The treatment of the developing countries, there were several comments on that. Let me say first that the WTO is the more democratic international organization there is. There is no directory, there is no Security Council. Every member has a voice, every member has the same time to comment. Every member has the space, and sometimes very small and unmotivated countries take a lot of space in the work of the WTO. Beyond that, the EU is so clearly committed in favor of development. I mean, and it's widely recognized. We have shown the way on fundamental issues, and we do so, including in the Bali package, the duty-free, quota-free, the anything but arms, but also in the Bali package, the rules of origin and other, everything that is there, the EU is a positive force and is seen as such in the wider framework of the WTO. India has a chance to move, and that's what I hope will do. My point on substance was repeated 2 or 3 times. I don't say that, let me be clear, the Indian requests are requests of substance as far as the public stockpiling is concerned, and as far as the food security concerns that the government has are fundamentally important debates and issues. My point is that the link with trade facilitation is a tactical, is political. And that's where I said that the way forward is that we move with the necessary flexibility, but respecting the Bali outcome. That means that the trade facilitation has to move on. In terms of timing, because this was picked up too, I said that it's a matter of weeks, because we have meetings now in the WTO that every day make the atmospherics more difficult, more tense. That cannot advance. It's clear that the committees, the negotiating work cannot advance without unblocking of the situation. So this work certainly in a tension, crisis building process, and so we cannot go on for too long. If we are to recover, it has to happen. It's a matter of weeks, I would consider. The developing countries, there are a lot of aspects there, but I think I gave an overall answer. I will not come back. The same thing with TISA. China, as I said, we, and Jean-Luc said it too, we have expressed a positive position on China joining TISA, but there is a debate that is linked to the other plurilateral steps that need to happen in the coming weeks and few months. The plan B that was mentioned to avoid freezing. In fact, the plan B that I mentioned is not a plan B that we have, is the dynamics of the situation. Or we will manage to unfrozen the situation and move and recover the multilateral path as we had it before, or the organization will be pushed very strongly into a debate about a plurilateral option for the trade facilitation and a wider discussion about what would this mean for the way the organization will work from now on. Because we would be talking then about a plurilateral option for what is the core of the multilateral process up to now. The Bali outcome is a multilateral outcome. And transforming this core outcome into a plurilateral debate, it's something that will have wider repercussions in the organization. The final comment, if I can take only 1 more minute, because this question about TTIP, and there were several comments made about the link with the bilateral discussions. Look, making a long story short, I'm very much of the opinion that expressed also a couple of times the DG of the WTO, Roberto Azevedo, with whom we have worked for a sufficient number of years, so that we have a kind of convergence of mind in several issues. And he said that the right image that we must have is a pyramid, where the foundations of the pyramid, or the first layer, is the multilateral rules and disciplines, and the bilateral builds on it. Because naturally, bilaterally, members can go further in liberalizing or in building regulatory convergence or compatibility, naturally. Much easier bilaterally than multilaterally. So if you have this image of the challenge of the trade policy, the foundation, the plurilateral rules and disciplines on which are built the bilaterals or the plurilaterals that in fact are pushing liberalization and regulatory convergence and compatibility further and prepare the next step of multilateral rules. That's the challenge. That's the balance that we need to preserve. Easy to say, difficult to do, but that's the permanent challenge that we have, and that's how we have to see it. The bilaterals and the plurilaterals have to contribute to the next steps of the multilateral processes. Chair, I feel like apologizing because I missed a certain points of the questions, but I think I captured those that were repeated more than once at least. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Ambassador, and I'm totally sure that you will be not the last time here in the committee, and we can continue our discussion further time. Thanks a lot again, and now we close this point of